let's move straight away to comments and questions. So we'll start here. Please introduce yourself and try to be kind of reasonably brief. So.
Thank you. Ichiro Yamamoto. I represent JICA to the European Union based in Brussels. I have two questions to Susan and one question to Liz. And to Susan, sorry about a little bit, may give you a little bit provocative, if not offending questions, about evidence-based policy making. How can you maneuver to make evidence-based policy making under the current so-called F process, where State Department make decisions based on US foreign policy decision? The second question about the use of country system, if it means that use of country system means budget support, but how were you able to convince your Congress about putting American tax money into the envelope of other country government, which United States do not rely on so much? And the question to Liz is about, I was very much impressed by the new approach of DFID on result-based aid, but aren't you worried about the possibility or likelihood of diverting DFID funds into from more long-term challenges, which doesn't yield immediate impact, such as governance, democracy, and agriculture? Thank you.
Okay, great. Behind, if we can go behind first, then here, and then to Andrew, and then.
My name is Stracha Safa from the African Development Bank. My question is directed to Liz. I have two questions coming from Ethiopia again. You've presented the pilot case. What I would like to know is that it is a pilot case. It's still under being implemented. There isn't much of evidence as yet. But the question is, when we focus on result, don't you expect some to lose the privilege to influence to transfer knowledge? Because I remember our engagement within the donor group was quite really close, and we've been able to make quite a lot of progress by transferring knowledge and experiences and skills from other countries during the process of making PBS, for example, the Protecting Basic Social Services, where we had annual meetings and the rest of it. That is one of the questions I have for Liz. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we come here and then over to Andrew and then back to the panel?
I'd like to thank
you will get a chance.
both as well for the really interesting presentations. I was actually looking for the link between the two presentations, because you were talking about use of country systems and you were talking about results, and the ultimate link between two is basically how do you actually use the local results, or let's say how do you measure through the local systems, and that would be the monitoring and evaluation system of any country. And especially with the DFID examples, I'd like to know, have you actually been able to use those data systems in order to have the results that you were expecting?
Thank you very much. Okay, back here, and then you will be the first question in the next round. Thank you very much.
Hello, Andrew Rogerson. I'm very pleased to see that there's been so much progress on the results agenda and on the pilot schemes. It was about 18 months ago, it seems like yesterday, that I was sharing a platform with Nancy Birdsall, representing the OECD, actually, talking about COD aid, and in particular the Ethiopia project, which was in its formative stages. My question is to your last point on incentives. In a sense, you haven't done a fair trial of whether this thing is scalable or not, because the deal should be, Ethiopia, how about if I substitute my input-based aid with this new form of aid? This shifts the risks completely, and it also, it shifts also the risks on both sides. We haven't done that, and we can probably show that actually, if I was Ethiopia, I would say it was a no-brainer. It's almost like a free lunch. I mean, I would hope that my results are good and my payoff is good, but I'm getting something on top of what I would otherwise get. Try to speculate a little bit as to where you think this can go, also for other countries that maybe don't have such low costs and high, quick results impacts as Ethiopia.
Thank you very much. These are fairly kind of gritty and detailed questions, so I'm actually going to go back to the panel at this point. Susan, do you want to start, and then I'll come to you.
Sure, I'll be very quick. And thank you for the questions and for our collaboration with JICA. And no, they're not provocative or offensive. They're very fact-based, so I appreciate your understanding of our system. One of the things I didn't mention that is very important, as we've launched into this reform movement, the administrator was very clear, Administrator Shah, when he was selected to take this position, actually 3 years ago, he talked to Secretary Clinton about the importance of USAID having its own budget authority. This was something in 1998 that the budget oversight for USAID's budget was given to the State Department. And as a result, she fully supported this. Obviously, his argument was, if I'm going to be responsible for the results and accountable, we need to have an independent budget authority and office to manage that. So we have the Office of Budget Resources and Management that really does provide that oversight and is equal to the F division of the State Department, for those of you who know our bureaucracy, really working through the issues. So that has been a significant step forward and a very important question that you asked. The second about Congress, as I mentioned in sort of the challenges, this is one of the challenges of how do we not only get our congressional members on board, but others in, to speak very frankly, in the lobbying industry who are representing certain organizations on board. And it has been a challenge. We spend a tremendous amount of time doing outreach to those constituencies. And the most important thing, I think, is that they want to be part of the conversation. And so we've actually developed a very active outreach component to this major reform effort, so that not only are they part of the conversation, frankly, to be honest, they have been on the front lines of delivering development results over the last several decades, and they are partners, and they should be treated as such. And so as we're making this shift, having them at the table helping and guiding us as we move forward is really important. And as far as the budget support, that is always going to be a concern. We have inquiries throughout the government about when we do transfer resources, and that's an important point as we make it to developing countries, about oversight, about accountability, and about transparency. So while it's additional work, frankly, it's something that we welcome because we hope that it will ultimately improve our performance.
Thank you very much, Susan. Liz.
Thanks. Well, what an interesting set of questions.
Yeah.
On DFID's approach, and are we risking only doing the short-term kind of impacts over long-term challenges? I mean, I think when you look at DFID's portfolio, that risk is not being realised. I think we recognise it as a risk, but it's not one which is being realised. If you look at what DFID is doing in fragile states, no one would argue that they're easy countries to go and deliver quick wins in. And what we're doing in governance and security more broadly, and including building a much stronger theme around empowerment and accountability than perhaps the UK had recently. So I think for me, the opportunity that we have is to combine some things that deliver quite tangible output level change alongside in our portfolio having things which are much more about the longer term drivers. And there's no point delivering short-term gains which are all lost. I think the other thing we're doing is that even where we're clear that you can measure a very definable output, we're interested in the outputs that have the potential to deliver transformational change. So I think that's for us where evidence really comes into play. So we should be looking at what does the evidence tell us about what works over the long term. So for example, it's very easy to deliver an apparently very tangible change around a girl remaining in school for another 3 or 4 years than she would otherwise have done. And on one level, you could say that's just a short-term output. The evidence internationally tells us that the impact of a girl staying for another 3 years in school is huge. It impacts on her health, it impacts on the stage at which she has children, it impacts on her economic opportunities. So what we're doing is using the evidence to say what are the outputs that are measurable and tangible, but which actually we think the evidence is really clear that those outputs have a long-term effect and will translate through into outcomes and into impact. And so I think that's something that's how we approach that challenge. In terms of the question from the African Development Bank, do we lose the ability to influence if we go to this mechanism? I think the world that we all want to build, that we're trying to achieve through post-Busan and through the Global Partnership now, is a world where we share knowledge and transfer knowledge across the world, whether it be from south-south or north-south, but where ideally where that knowledge is desired and wanted. So for me, we wouldn't be, if we were a world in which we were making major resource transfers through a results-based aid, but actually where the knowledge that we had developed, for example, in the UK, was valued and sought by partners, and in which we still had influence and were interested in passing that knowledge on. Those two things can go alongside each other very, very effectively. So for me, it's not kind of either or. And coming back to Andrew's question, actually, of course, the reality is currently we're testing these things out in environments in which we're still engaged and very much at the centre of some of the other programmes that go around it. How do we measure? In these two examples, we're measuring through country systems, and so we are absolutely using the country systems. But because the payment trigger is about results, that's why we're putting the independent verification on top of that. But it is about using country systems. And I think the interesting thing about the pilots is actually they're kind of creating a greater demand and importance around the country system, and perhaps creating some incentives for countries themselves to strengthen those systems. So I think that's how it's working currently. Andrew's big question. Well, no, we haven't given it a fair trial yet because the world is not an experiment that we can design perfectly to sort of control all the variables, etc. And I think it's kind of akin to where we were with budget support, because did we ever really test budget support in a fair way either? We're always doing budget support alongside everything else. The hypothesis around budget support was really kind of designed with an imagination that budget support would be the main transfer mechanism. So no, we haven't given it a trial effectively in that sense yet. But does that mean we can't learn from what we're doing? No, I don't think it does. I think we can still learn from it. I would like to see a world in which lots of other countries are trying it out too, and where we start to build a bigger critical mass of evidence from which we can draw conclusions. But we're always going to face this challenge of, you can't wipe the slate clean and start again. So it's a very messy world to be trying to evaluate.
So what's the difference the countries using country system and budget support? I don't understand. What's the difference using country system and budget support?
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Sorry, just very quickly. Can we try and go through the chair? Otherwise, we will lose the plot in general. But do you want to take that quickly, Liz?
Well, these examples are all using...
Would relate. Okay, all right. Let's go into the second round of questions then and go here.
Thank you very much. That question was actually...
Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name is Marianne Ado. I come from Ghana, Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. I want to thank both presenters for their presentation, and this really goes to Susan, because when you were talking about use of country systems, you didn't really give any examples, but in the work that we've done in the Working Party on aid effectiveness, I mean, we've come out with certain areas, if you like, that you can call use of country systems. For example, using audit systems or putting it on treasury, or it's not necessarily budget support.
That's correct.
Okay,
right.
But then I wanted to jump to two things. Would the US consider doing budget support? And I'm being very specific now. Let's say in Ghana, one, when the donors locally have told us they're going to be pulling out, a couple of them are pulling out. Two, the US, as I understand, does not really do budget support or even use country systems. I mean, you don't commingle your funds with other funds, whether it's other donor funds or local funds. So that's the first one. Then specifically again on Ghana, because of the work we're doing in country systems, again with the US, with the previous rep to the DAC, there is some work that has been started on ensuring that our audit system is robust enough to be used by the USAID. There are other donors that already use our audit system anyway, by the way, but I feel this work has gone on for too long. It's a year and a half. We're nowhere near getting to the point where it will be good enough for USAID to use the system. So I just wondered if you could comment a bit on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take another 4 questions, which I've already seen very quickly, and that is going to be all, I'm afraid. Can you please come here? Otherwise, we'll go too far into the coffee break.
Serena Brown from KPMG. Based on the early work in adapting social impact bonds from reducing recidivism in a small part of the UK to working in a development context, what's your sense of whether they're going to represent good value for money, from both of you, and whether it's something you're excited about that could become quite a significant mechanism?
Thank you very much. Ben, next.
Ben Ramalingam, IDS and ADI. Two quick questions. One is related to the topic before this session on fragile states. Clearly the results agenda needs to be adapted and innovated with in order to deal with the challenges of fragile states. Have you got examples of doing that in your respective organisations? The second question is really, I guess, something that comes out of the next session and a paper which David Booth wrote, which talks about development success as being a collective action problem. It seems to me that the systems that you're suggesting actually reinforce the principal agent problem. It's really a case of trying to make it work better rather than moving towards collective action. I just wonder if you've got reflections on that.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Can we come here?
Hi, I'm Sarah Mully from IPPR. You both talked about risk and managing risk and transferring risk, and I just wonder how that relates to the challenge of securing political support for aid in donor countries. So, how do you have those conversations about risk with ministers, with parliamentarians, and ultimately with the public?
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. Can we go over to John Glennie now, please, over this side?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for your presentations. Real privilege to be working with USAID on this issue, and pleased to see that some of our thinking is already being taken seriously over there. I suppose I've got quite a challenging question, which Ed Hedger calls my meta question, which is, so feel free to ignore it and answer more specific ones. But it's kind of my instinct is that there's an overemphasis on aid modalities. It seems to me it's almost. Am I right in thinking that DFID is moving away from budget support? Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's certainly the kind of anecdotal pub chat. That there's, now DFID is moving towards results-based aid. My instinct is that in 5 years' time we'll be moving on to something else. There are fundamental problems at the heart of aid transfer, movement of monies, results. We all know these problems. We've been working in this business. They're really, really complicated. My instinct is that we still think that we're going to find some kind of solution to them. Where maybe we should just accept that they're just, whatever the next fad, if I may use the term, we're going to be facing the same one, which I don't mean to, that sounds incredibly negative, and I don't mean to say that we shouldn't be keeping to try and deal with them, but I feel like we should have a limited, what I call a limited ambition with regard to what we expect to achieve with our latest aid modality. And there is one much more specific question, which is on the issue of budget support. I'm leading this work, and there's one issue that's coming up, and it's kind of a bit of a contradiction between those people that say that it doesn't matter if some people use budget support and other donors don't, it's complementary, and other evidence that we've got that actually those that aren't using budget support or aren't going on system are undermining the process of strengthening those systems. I just wondered if either of you had any comments on that question.
Thanks very much indeed. Apologies to those whose questions I didn't get to, but we'll be carrying on in the same area after the coffee break, so hopefully there'll be chances for you then. Liz, do you want to
Well, maybe
start?
can I start with this one, because I think I've understood the question, but maybe tell me if not. I think if you compare budget support to the say the Ethiopia pilot, in budget support you're putting money into the country exchequer. The country exchequer is using that money, and it's telling the donors, the financiers, what it's achieved, for example, against its national plan, etc. And that's the sort of cycle. In this example, the exchequer is using its money to deliver something, and at the point at which the contracts stipulates, we are paying as agreed for a set of things that the country has done with its own money. So it's a different dynamic of resource use. It sort of changes the dynamic of that. KPMG impact bonds, do I think they're going to be good? I have no idea whether they're going to be good value for money. Are they interesting and exciting? Yes, I think so. I mean, it's got to be worth exploring. I think sometimes the sort of international development world has been too sort of insular and focused on its own sort of experiences and sort of just churning them round and round. And I think what people are trying to do now is sort of try things from other worlds that might work, and I think that's really worth pursuing. So I think it's worth pursuing. fragile states, how do you adapt to the challenges? I think the biggest challenge for sort of results in fragile states, in a sense, I'm not sure that many of the issues are very different in fragile states. I think that data availability is definitely a difference. It's a real difference. You know, there is just a lot less data in some of these states, and that poses real challenges around measurement. And we have to be innovative about how we think about measuring, valuing, identifying change. Where to go is next? Risk. Risk is. Risk, I think, is a really interesting question. I think the discussions in Busan and the discussions in the New Deal around fragile states, all of the work that's come together under the leadership of East Timor in the New Deal discussions, is all about having a more frank, upfront conversation about risk and about how both parties, all parties, are going to manage things if things go wrong. And I think that's a really healthy conversation for us to be having. I'm not sure it's gone as far as it needs to yet, but I think I would hope that it's one of the areas that the Global Partnership can make some progress on as well. I think, you know, kind of really having frank conversations about risk and what to do when things don't go as expected or don't go right, I think is really helpful. The sort of meta question. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about, you know, from my time in this world and how I've seen things change, and there are people here with much longer memories than me, is that we're much more embracing of diversity than we used to be. We kind of used to have a paradigm that kind of said everybody should be like let's work out what good practice is and then everybody should be like that. And I think one of the things, again, that the work in Busan is about is saying, no, actually, there's a role for some very different kinds of development cooperation in the world. Emerging economies probably are going to do things in very different ways. Should they be like DAC donors? No, not necessarily. Let's harness that diversity. And I think there's a kind of much more embracing of diversity, which I personally think is good. I think it's about kind of, you know, there is no one size fits all, and we shouldn't pretend there is. Neither is there a silver bullet, and we shouldn't pretend there is. So I share the skepticism about magic solutions, but I think that we are more embracing of diversity, and we should really build on that.
Fantastic, Liz. Thanks, Susan.
Okay, I will quickly close because Liz did such a great job of, I think, answering all of those questions, and I really align with all of her, responses. And I just wanted to close, but we're really with this meta issue because I think, you know, as we're all looking at reform and approaches, it's exactly right. There is no silver bullet. Having spent most of the last couple decades actually in the field, ultimately development is a risky business. There will be things that work, there will be things that don't work. It often comes down to personal relationships. It comes down to leadership. It comes down to political will. And so while we need evidence and we need data in order to guide us as we move forward, I think we ultimately, as development thought leaders and practitioners, need to really acknowledge the human element in this. And as Liz said, having the flexibility of choices to allow our partners to really choose what is best for them as we move forward. And it is really challenging. I mean, I think particularly as we're entering an incredibly fiscal austere moment, at least in the United States, as we're talking about things such as the fiscal cliff and what happens if we have to make major cuts. And, you know, we've been through challenging times before, and so evidence and data is obviously very important as it guides our decision making. But ultimately, our approach has been very much about outreach and working with developing a constituency within the United States, whether they're students or through the universities or definitely with Congress, in helping them understand why this is so important, whether it's to our national security or to the global community, depending upon the interests of that stakeholder. And we have a lot of work to do, but as Homi said yesterday, the average American thinks that we spend 25% on foreign aid and it should be cut to 10%. Well, as as you know, it's only 1%. If we could have 10% of our budget dedicated to foreign assistance, we'd be in a much better situation. And on the questions to Ghana, I'm happy to talk to you during the coffee break because I think they are very particular. And one of the things about USAID is we're extremely decentralized. Our mission directors and our teams really do have the authority, and we provide the guidance and oversight. And anybody else who wants to talk during the coffee break, happy to find some time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Many thanks to both the speakers.